Well, so far, the United States has been the single biggest donor of military aid to Ukraine, sending nearly $24 billion worth of military equipment to help fight the Russian invasion. But there are concerns that the Republican Party, which now controls Congress, could limit future U.S. support. Republicans are pushing for more oversight in government spending, suggesting that future funding might not be as forthcoming as it once was.
We've always been there. We're the first responder to almost everything that goes bad in the world. And I think we've earned the right to question about, you're asking our taxpayers to invest heavy amounts of money. Let's let them know exactly what it's for.
Our partners in Europe really need to step up and make sure that they're carrying their weight, carrying some of the load with the Ukraine.
We want to help the Ukrainian people and push back against Russia, but we want to make sure that we're spending our U.S. tax dollars well.
Domestic American policies impact international policy. International policy now impacts domestic policy. So I think that if they just kind of pay attention and watch what we're doing here on the floor right now, they'll see that America's coming back stronger than ever, and we're going to basically be able to take the world stage back the way we once did.
The far right consists of arsonists who are intent on burning down everything, including the full faith and credit of the United States. I worry that a Republican majority heightens the risk of a government shutdown. It heightens the risk of a debt default, which could derail the full faith and credit of the United States and with it the American economy.
Well, let's dig deeper into this with our Washington correspondent Sumi Somaskanda. Welcome, Sumi. So we just heard scepticism there from Republican congressmen and women and concerns about US tax dollars for Ukraine being wisely spent. Are Republicans gearing up for a fight on this issue now that they control the House?
I think it's fair to say that some members of the Republican Party are certainly gearing up for a fight, particularly members of this hard right faction of the Republican Party. They have made clear from the beginning that they do not support these huge amounts of money and military aid flowing to Ukraine continuously. And I think that was really cast in stark relief when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Washington in December, and we saw him speak on the floor of Congress. And a few members of that hard right faction declined to stand during those standing ovations that members of Congress from both sides of the aisle were delivering during his speech to Congress. I think it's important to note that beyond that hard right faction, there are Republicans who are uneasy, as we heard in that clip just beforehand, about the money and hardware going to support Ukraine's defenses. They want to change the way that aid for Ukraine has been agreed until now. Again, the Democrats in control of the House of Representatives, and they waved through a lot of this aid without much opposition. And that is something that some of the new Republicans in Congress want to change. That being said, on a whole, Republicans say that they do still stand firmly behind Ukraine. And we actually reached out to the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives and the Foreign Affairs Committee, led by Republicans at the moment, and they urge more action on Ukraine. I think we've pulled up that statement now. They said the current indecision and self-deterrence will prolong the war, costing Ukrainian lives. Now is time for the Biden and Scholz governments to follow the lead of our UK and Eastern European allies. Leopard 2 tanks, ATACMS, and other long-range precision munitions should be approved without delay. So I know we're going to talk about the tanks, but interesting there to see that foundation of support does remain among Republicans.
Well, let's talk about those tanks. I mean, do you see how do you see the likelihood of the US changing its stance on sending those Bradleys into Ukraine?
You know, Phil, it's definitely not off the table. The U.S. is thinking, rather, about these Abrams 1 tanks, as you said, these modern battle tanks. Until now, the Biden administration has declined to send these to Ukraine, but that doesn't mean we might not see a change in stance. Remember that the U.S. originally didn't send these Patriot missile systems for Ukraine. It changed its stance on that. So we could see, again, a change in policy. But we know that this is the biggest point of discussion, or one of the biggest points of discussion among allied powers right now. And as we heard earlier in the show, it is likely to be top of the agenda at that meeting of defense ministers in Ramstein on Friday in Germany. Observers here, Phil, are very much pointing to that meeting as being significant and seeing what Germany decides to do, because among the commentary and reaction I've seen here, there is some head scratching and frustration that Germany has not taken this step on its own, even though the U.S. has mostly been in charge on sending and leading the charge, rather, on sending various weapons and systems and moving the needle on what is being sent. They see this decision as really being up to Germany. So we anticipate that that will be the point of discussion first and foremost with Germany's new defense minister on Friday.
OK, I misspoke a little earlier. Bradleys have been sent. Abrams, as you say, are what are on the table. Do the US and Germany have the same reasons for their reluctance to provide these heavy weapons to Ukraine?
They don't, Phil, and I actually think that's where some of the frustration stems from. Of course, Washington and Berlin, European allies, they weigh up a number of factors when they decide which weapons are sent to Ukraine and when. Factors like, will these weapons be useful? Are they practical for the type of battle that Ukraine is engaged in at the moment? Will it provoke Russia? So could the U.S., for example, be dragged into an active conflict with Russia? But defense officials here say the reason that they, to this point, have declined to send these Abrams tanks is not because they're worried about Russia's response, but because they're not practical. These are huge, incredibly heavy tanks. I read somewhere they're around 70 tons. They are hard to use. They're hard to maintain. They are gas guzzlers, and it would take weeks to train Ukrainian troops on how to use them. In comparison, the Leopard tanks that are German-made, they're considered to be a far better fit, which is why the Biden administration, again, has been looking to Germany to lead on this decision. Now, one more note about the Abrams tanks. All of that being said, I mentioned already there was reticence in Washington to send the Patriot air missile systems for use in Ukraine. Those were eventually approved by President Biden. And right now, as we speak, dozens of Ukrainian forces are actually training on those systems in Oklahoma. So there is scope for such a decision to be made on the Abrams tanks, even if they're not particularly practical. But again, just underlining the fact that the U.S. is looking to Germany to make a decision on those Leopard tanks indeed.
Always good to talk to you. Thanks for that, Sumi Somaskanda in Washington. Already ahead of a major meeting at Germany's Ramstein Air Base on Friday, pledges of new weapons worth billions of dollars are rolling in. But the delivery of one weapon in particular hangs in the balance: German-made Leopard tanks. Today, the US and German defense ministers tried to resolve the standoff during talks in Berlin. Germany's reluctant to approve the export to Ukraine despite intense international pressure. And the country's newly sworn-in defence minister, Boris Pistorius, got a taste of that pressure during his first day on the job.
A busy first day in office. Shortly after getting his certificate of appointment, Boris Pistorius met his US counterpart, Lloyd Austin. Both of them signaled their unified stance.
I'd like to thank the German government for all that it has done to strengthen Ukraine's self-defense and your contributions of security assistance and training for Ukraine's defenders have been invaluable.
As so often in history, the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States of America stand side by side in their approach, but also on the concrete issues, be it the infantry fighting vehicles, the Patriot air defense system, or the multiple rocket launchers.
But for many, in Germany and further afield, one thing is missing: battle tanks for Ukraine. Something that, beneath the show of unity, is turning into a growing dilemma for both countries. According to media reports, Germany would allow German-made Leopard tanks to be sent to Ukraine if the US agrees to send its own. While there is still division within the German government on that matter, US officials have insisted that Washington has no plans to send US-made tanks to Ukraine for now. Expectations are growing ahead of Friday's meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group session at Ramstein Air Base in southern Germany. A meeting where the two countries might be able to settle the tank debate, at least for now.
So as we just heard, Germany might be ready to drop its objections if the US sends its tanks in first. So was that on the table today? Here's our political correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber.
We presume that it was on the table today and that it also will be on the table tomorrow on Friday with this important meeting at Ramstein Air Base in southern Germany. And that's something that was already mentioned in a press release by the US Department of Defense, saying 10 countries and counting will have a meeting on the sideline of the contact group meeting, focused particularly on the issue of getting Leopard tanks to Ukraine. That's always a difficult topic for the German Chancellor. He was pressed specifically on these tanks also a few days ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he said that it's important that Germany has sent several heavy weapons already. He mentioned several of them, but he has not answered yet if Germany also wants to send these tanks. We have these media reports that were also mentioned in the piece that Germany would wait for the US to send the Abrams tanks, and then Germany would continue to send these Leopard tanks to Ukraine. So there will definitely be take center stage at this meeting of the Ukraine defense group in Ramstein, where they will talk about further arms deliveries, and very important, and what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been asking for repeatedly, to send main battle tanks to Ukraine as quickly as possible.
Well, as the US and German defence ministers met in Berlin, NATO military chiefs from the other members of NATO held talks in Brussels. NATO says it's preparing for the long haul in Ukraine as Russia's war nears the year mark. The NATO allies are exploring ways to expand the delivery of weapons, training and support to Ukraine in the coming months. But along with problems of supplying some of the more advanced military systems, there are also concerns about the depletion of ammunition, bullets and shells to fire from the weapons that Ukraine already has. DW's Terry Schultz spoke about those issues with Kristi Raik, who's Deputy Director of Estonia's International Centre for Defence and Security.
It is definitely a concern, but it can also be said that NATO countries have not been giving as much as they could give. So now we are having new decisions again. Estonia just announced a new major aid package bigger than any of the previous ones, which includes heavy weaponry and ammunition. And Estonia is also working hard on replenishing its own stocks, and really wishes to kind of show an example to other allies that there should be more awareness that we need to give more to Ukraine now because it is in our own security interest. But that understanding, I think, is still not quite at the same level in all allied countries, and especially when it comes to giving heavy weaponry. The Baltic states think that we must give heavy weaponry to Ukraine so that Ukraine can liberate territories. It can be ready for a new Russian offensive to push back that. And it's in our security interest. Whereas in Germany, I still get the impression that sometimes the thinking is on the contrary, that giving heavy weaponry to Ukraine might be counterproductive to Germany's security interest, which doesn't make sense from the Baltic point of view.
Is it frustrating to you to see that everybody's not willing to give 100%?
I think it is really worrying that the understanding of what the West needs to do in Ukraine and how existentially important the war in Ukraine is for European security as a whole, that they still differ among different European countries. And that's, I think, the most worrying part, that Germany has not seen that it is in Germany's own security interest to give heavy weaponry, including battle tanks, to Ukraine. That this judgment can be so different. And that also makes you think then what could be then the situation in a possible scenario of collective defense. It does raise these questions, right? It makes a difference whether a country is a NATO member or not, and Ukraine is not, the Baltic states are. But still seeing all this German hesitation, it has weakened Germany's credibility as an ally.
Security analyst Kristi Raik. So why is Kyiv so adamant about these Leopard 2 tanks? Our next report hears from Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines who tell us why modern Western equipment is so desperately needed.
A Ukrainian base in the Kharkiv region. The area has been under Russian fire again since the weekend. Tatiana Haidemashko and her medical team are looking after this tank brigade. The men have been stationed here for weeks.
These are Russian projectiles. Nearly every day and night they fire at my colleagues and our ambulances. At the moment, we only have 2 of these vehicles. At least this one survived.
Haidamashko inspects the vehicle they use as an ambulance. It has to hold out a while longer. There's no money to replace it. That worries her. There are more and more bullet holes.
These are all old cars that volunteers donated to us. They buy up cheap old cars, then they bring them here and give them to us. We then repair them all the time because they keep breaking down.
It's not just the makeshift ambulances. Tank officer Mikola Timko is worried about the condition of his own vehicles. We're fighting here with old tanks from the Soviet Union, with the same tanks the Russians have. To have an advantage to break through the Russian front lines, we need more modern main battle tanks like the Leopard 2. So far, his unit has been using old Soviet T-72 battle tanks from the early 1970s. The tanks have seen a lot of use, and some of them are badly damaged. Hence the push to get Leopard 2s as soon as possible. I'm sure our soldiers will master the modern technology. Soldiers who have combat experience with the T-72 will learn to master the Leopard very quickly. The soldiers here are waiting for Russia to mount another major offensive. Dr. Haidamashko is going to stay here, though she could earn much more money in Kyiv.
I'm exhausted, tired all the time. I'd like to go to my little daughter who's waiting for me at home, but I know that the soldiers here need me more. Even when I'm gone for a short time, I worry about how the men are doing.
One at this base hopes that the new modern tanks will arrive soon.